Good deal.
Not really, because John T has surgery.
I've been giving the thumbs up, so we're ready to get started. I call that the crew thumbs up, because he started me doing that. Our little 5, almost 6-year-old grandson, when he likes something, he goes just like that right there. And if you don't like it, that right there. So I know I got the thumbs up, so we're good to go. It's good to see each one of you this morning. Been absent a couple of days, but we're back. Donna's getting better, and I'm anticipating something happening to me in about 3 weeks. My right knee. So just y'all pray that'll go well. But it is good to be here this morning. It's good to see each one of you. We have another good lesson today, and the title of it is "When Your Provisions Fall Short." And I think this is the 4th lesson in the first part of our books that deals with faith. And I know all of you know what faith is, but if you want a good definition for faith, go to Hebrews 11 verse 1, and I wrote that down. It's now faith is a substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen yet. So that's important to believe in the Lord. And some of the Old Testament people, that's what they had. They had faith. In the book of Hebrews, talks about Abraham and Cain and those other people, Abel, how they had faith, and they counted them as righteous, and Noah and some others as well. But we'll go ahead and look at some things here before we get into the lesson. I always do a little bit of research, I guess you could call it that, on whoever the main character is or main person in our lesson today, and just give me a chance to go over a couple of things here. And anyway, first of all, we know that this is the 4th lesson that deals with faith. There are 2 more to come, and Tommy and Jane will cover those later, I'm sure. Let's see here. I wanted to talk. We're going to be talking about Elijah today, and our scripture today comes from 1 Kings 17, verses 5 through 16. And before we get into the material in our book, I'll just go ahead and give you what I found out about. I know all of you know who Elijah was, and of course it comes from the book of 1 Kings. Now, being the history buff that I am, I like to do research and stuff on particular the books as well. And 1st and 2nd Kings, one follows the other. And according to scholars now, whether you don't bet the house on this, but we have to go by what they say sometimes. It's not, the Bible is the source, but if we're looking at times and all that stuff, 1st and 2nd Kings were probably written by Jeremiah. They think it was written by him. And it could have been other people too, or other prophets besides him that lived. Jeremiah lived after Elijah and came after Elijah, somewhere around the year 562 BC. And I found this very interesting when I was researching this, that the books of 1st and 2nd Kings were originally one book, and then they broke them down later on for whatever reason. I don't know. I didn't find that. But anyway, the book, as our lesson today said, the scripture comes from 1 Kings. And the whole book of 1 Kings deals with several things. First of all, it deals with David's death. It deals with Solomon's reign. And it also deals with the division of the kingdom and Elijah's ministry, which is what our lesson today is about. Now, also when I was reading about this, why did the kingdom split up? And there was a reason for that too. And I found out, of course, there were 2 kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was made up of 10 tribes, and it was known as Israel. And the southern kingdom was known as Judah, was made up of 2 tribes. And what I could find out is what caused them to split up. Solomon was ruling at that time, and he imposed some heavy taxes on these kingdoms. And he did that because Solomon was a builder. He liked to build things, and he spent a lot of money on extravagant things, and that they didn't like that. Do y'all like taxes? I don't think so. I didn't think you do. But taxes are what makes our government go. Just sometimes we don't realize how fair or unfair they are, and sometimes they come at a bad time too. But anyhow, that's besides the point. But anyhow, going on with some of these other things here that I found. And we'll get into this in the lesson, but the scripture in today's lesson, it deals with Elijah confronts King Ahab. He's another character in Jezebel, his wife. And he confronts King Ahab about them worshiping Baal, which was a pagan god. And God created a drought. This drought lasted for like 3.5 years. Can you imagine what it would be like here if we didn't get rain for 3.5 years? All of us that garden would be in trouble, wouldn't we? Unless we had water to irrigate them with. But they didn't. I don't reckon they did that back then. They may have, but this drought has lasted 3.5 years. And usually when you have a drought, you're going to have a famine, where there's crops don't grow, people starve, people are hungry, and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, God brought this drought on because of their worshiping this false god, this pagan god. We'll talk a little bit more about him in just a minute, about Baal, or what he was. He wasn't a person. But and it also, in the lesson, we're going to find out, and we're talking about faith now. God, if you have faith in it, things will happen. You remember the story about the mustard seed. If you have faith of a mustard seed, you can move mountains and so forth. But anyhow, the story of today in our lesson tells about Elijah confronting a poor widow woman, and she was a Gentile, by the way, too, who feeds him, and she's blessed for it. Now, there's some other, I know that these things that I'm fixing to tell you about here, I found interesting, I hope you do too, about Elijah. Elijah, according to what I found, a timeline of his ministry and life, he was born around 900 BC. This was, 3,000 years ago nearly. And if you keep up with dates in BC, you count backwards down to the year 0 when Christ was born, which is actually, according to some people, he was born about 4 BC. But whatever, that doesn't matter. But when you use the dates of BC, you go back, you count backwards. So in 900 BC, Elijah was born. In 874 BC, now he would have only been 26 years old, Ahab becomes king. In 873 BC, Ahab builds an altar in the temple of Baal. They were worshiping this false god. 870 BC, Elijah warns King Ahab that God would send a drought, which, as I mentioned earlier, would lead to a famine and would last for several years. What I found out was 3.5 years, as punishment for worshiping this false god. I'll tell you a little bit about the god in a minute. 869 BC, God instructed Elijah to go to a widow in Sidon, and this is where Jezebel came from. I think it was in what's today the country of Lebanon, but they called it something else back then. Also in 869, Elijah brings back to life. Now this is not in our lesson, but it follows. It's in chapter 17, but it follows our scripture today. This widow had a young son, and during this time that he died. Elijah brings back to life the widow's only son. 876 BC. This is right after that, 2 years after that. The drought would end. And when the Baal prophets failed at Mount Carmel, Elijah challenged them to do the things that God could do. And they failed. And as a result, they were executed. These prophets of Baal were executed. And then right after that, God sent heavy rains that would end the drought. The rains been I don't know how they made it, but they did. There's one other thing that happened right after that, and which is important when I give you this last date. In 865 BC, Elijah anointed Elisha by placing his cloak on him to take his place. Now, there's several things that happened in between 865 BC, and y'all probably don't like studying about dates, but I'm sorry, just bear with me. In 865, Elijah anointed Elisha. You're so confused. They're tongue twisting, aren't they? And then, anyway, between that 865 and this next date, 849 BC, several other things happened, but I'm not going to bore you with them. But in 849 BC, Elijah was taken to heaven in a fiery chariot led by fiery horses in a whirlwind. Now, two other things I want to mention about him before we get into the lesson. You know that Elijah and Enoch were the only two people mentioned in the Bible that didn't die. God took them to heaven. Elijah was important. And one other thing that makes we know about Elijah was that when the transfiguration took place, when Christ took Peter, James, and John on this mountain, Moses and Elijah appeared to them. So he's definitely important to the Lord. Elijah was. And anyhow, just thought I'd throw that in there too. All right. And if you will now look on page 49 in your book, and we'll go ahead and begin in our book today. I did read the Hebrews 11:1 gives us the definition. If you want to know what faith is, that's the definition right there. You got to believe so. But anyhow, on page 49 in your book, our scripture in our lesson today, as I mentioned, comes from 1 Kings 17, verses 5 through 16. And the point in our lesson today, which really is you want to know what the lesson's about in a nutshell, then that's God provides what you need when you need it. If you have faith, you got to have faith. That's so important. Now, first question. What's the most inspirational survival story you've ever heard? Well, I tell you what came to mind for me. If y'all watch TV, you see these ads, especially if you watch Fox. Because a lot of these other stations, they don't show this. But there's an ad on there that a bunch of older Jewish women who are survivors of the Holocaust are scattered throughout Russia. And this organization asked for $25 donation to feed these people. It's so sad to see those people, those women, they show women, and the conditions that they live in, the homes, what they have to eat. That got to me. And this organization, I hope I remember this, was the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews is the name of it. And they ask you to send, I think it's $25. But to see these poor people, it's so sad. But these organizations are helping them. They're helping them. And then what got me, that they're survivors. Their parents were part of the Holocaust, and they were probably children when the Holocaust occurred. All right, as I mentioned earlier, Elijah is a main character in our lesson today. And on the right-hand side of your book, it tells some things which we're going to talk about in our lesson today too. They're kind of introducing us to this. A few thousand years ago, a prophet of God he lived through threats, drought, and devastating circumstances. And also, we know who he was. And this story today in our lesson, it gives us a glimpse of how we can trust God when provisions fall short. All right, now then, before we get into the writing on the next page right here, we always read the scripture. I want to give you a heads up on what was taking place. These were some notes in my Bible, and I thought they were very, very, very good notes. If you hadn't read the lesson, if you read these first, then you kind of get an idea of what the lesson's about. Elijah was the first in a long line of important prophets God sent to Israel and Judah. Now, I tried to see if there was a prophet before him. And if you look in the Bible, the way the Bible is organized, you've got the books, starting with Genesis and going on through. In 1 Kings,